For people who don't know who you are, just kind of give a brief background about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, I've been an academic most of my life. I have a PhD in economics. I've had research or teaching positions at Stanford, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, Yale. I was chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission. And more recently, I was senior advisor for research and statistics in the U.S. Department of Justice. So I've done academic stuff, and I've been in law enforcement type areas. But right now, I'm president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. We're a group of academics who do research on a wide range of crime issues, everything from vote fraud to guns to policing. So if it falls in crime, and it seems like most things fall in crime, we can cover it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've known about you for quite some time now. When I started my initial journey into my 2A advocacy, a lot of the stuff that I was researching and learning about with respect to statistics regarding firearms in this country, a lot of them were coming from you. It was a consistent, like, John Lott. I'm like, okay, wow. So in many ways, you were definitely part of the catalyst that kind of helped me start my 2A advocacy in a lot of ways. So I definitely like to thank you for that.
Well, that means a lot to me.
Yes, sir. So right now, and the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because a lot of people don't know or aren't fully aware of to what extent the number of people utilize firearms in self-defense situations. We're so used to seeing these headlines that talk about mass shootings or just generalized shootings or all the things that are negative that are happening with firearms when it comes to the mainstream media. But we never really talk about or really hear about all the times when people actually use guns to protect themselves, which is essentially one of the main purposes of the Second Amendment to begin with.
Right. Well, we just did an article that came out of Real Clear Investigations that looked at the question that you're raising there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's not surprising that people have the perception that you do. If you look at the top 5 largest newspapers in the United States, the New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal. Between those 5 papers, so far this year, they've had a total of 10 successful defensive gun use stories that have occurred. At the same time, they had over 2,700 gun crime stories where people were either killed or wounded as a result of a gun crime. So, you know, well-informed people who, you know, read those types of newspapers, or, you know, if you look at MSNBC, CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC, you find 0 defensive gun use stories that have occurred there. Yeah. So, you know, people may think that they're well-informed individuals, but it's not surprising that they have the type of perception that you were just describing. And, you know, the thing is, if you look at all newspapers, the defensive gun use stories that do get coverage tend to be in small local media markets that are covering local stories. And so far this year, there's been about 1,000 of those stories that have been covered. But even those, I think, really give people a misperception about the number and also the nature of these attacks. So I'll just give you one example, and that is, if you go through those stories, you find that about 43% of those involve defensive gun uses where somebody's killed. 42% of them involve defensive gun uses where somebody's been wounded. And only 4% of those involve a brandishing of a gun. And most of those involve unusual cases where the criminal's been held at gunpoint until police arrive. And the thing is, people need to understand that what makes a story newsworthy doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Academics who have looked at this type of issue find that about 95% of defensive gun uses merely involve brandishing of a gun. Well, you know, it's kind of the opposite percent of what they're getting there. And it's understandable. I'm not blaming the news media per se. I mean, if you have 2 stories, in one case there's a dead body on the ground and a sympathetic person like a victim. In another case, let's say a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be criminals run away, no shots fired, nobody's shot, no crime actually committed, you're not even completely sure what crime would have been committed. I think anybody would pick the first story of a dead body as being more newsworthy than the second one. You don't need to have any type of bias on the part of media editors or outlets in order to try to explain that.
Yeah.
But if you care about policy, you care about both types of cases, even though you may only care about one of those cases when you're talking about what's newsworthy. And so I think that explains part of it. And of course, that means you miss the massive number of defensive gun uses that don't involve guns being fired, don't involve people being killed or wounded. I mean, the rate that people are killed or wounded from defensive gun uses is well less than 1%. So you're missing almost all the cases that are out there. And so that explains part of it. I don't think it explains everything in terms of media coverage. You mentioned mass public shootings. Whenever a mass public shooting occurs, understandably, it gets a huge amount of news coverage. Mm-hmm. But at our website at crimeresearch.org, we've collected literally dozens of cases in just the last few years where legally armed citizens with permanent concealed handguns have stopped what police say otherwise would have been mass public shootings. And yet those cases virtually always get just a few local stories that occur on them. They virtually never get national news coverage. And when there is national news coverage, the national media invariably gets the story wrong. You could go and look at dramatic cases. So you have the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. Few people would know that just a week after that in South Carolina, there was another similar attack that was attempted. The person had shot 3 people and was in the process of shooting at a 4th person when someone with a permanent concealed handgun seriously wounded him and stopped the attack. The attacker there still had over 100 rounds on him.
I didn't know that either.
Now, the big difference between Florida and South Carolina is Florida was one of 10 states that banned people carrying permanent concealed handguns in establishments that got more than half of their revenue from alcohol. Oh, yeah. South Carolina was one of the 40 states that allowed people to be able to go and carry. Yeah. And so, but the South Carolina, you'd think, given the sensitivity that you just had this mass shooting in a nightclub that had gotten worldwide attention, you would think that this attempted attack that was stopped just a week later would have gotten some national news attention, but it didn't get any. Or take like the Parkland shooting. Mm-hmm. Just a few months after that, very close by, there was an attack at an elementary school event at a park right next to the school. A man had come up, started shooting. You had hundreds of students there as well as their parents. Fortunately, there was a vendor who was nearby who had a permanent concealed handgun and was able to come in and seriously wound the attacker there and stop the attack. Again, the only people that really heard about that case would be in the local media market. But given all the discussions about school shootings, you would think, here's a case that was stopped. You have a hero involved. You would think it might be newsworthy, but it's not newsworthy to the national media. My guess is the entire debate that we have right now would be dramatically different if even once in a while these types of heroic stories got accurate national news coverage. And also would mention that the successful attacks keep on occurring in places with gun-free zones. I'll give you one other example that did get national news coverage, but they completely messed it up. You remember the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh a few years ago. Mm-hmm. In just a few days after that, there was an attack at a Kroger grocery store in Louisville, Kentucky, where a man had gone in and was shooting blacks in the grocery store. What got national news attention was that the murderer there had come across a customer and he said, "Whites don't shoot whites." So that was kind of the lead on NBC, the press, everything. The thing is, they missed the first part of the quote. The full quote was, "Please don't shoot me. Whites don't shoot whites." So what had happened is that the customer there, who was white, had a permanent concealed handgun and was pointing his gun at the murderer. And rather than the murderer assuring the customer that the customer had nothing to worry about, the murderer there was begging the customer not to shoot the murderer.
Wow.
And so I actually was able to kind of text back and forth with Chuck Todd. He spent like 4 minutes on the story on Meet the Press. And I said, Chuck, I think you kind of missed part of the story here. Here are some links to local media in Louisville that have the full quote. You just had the whites don't shoot whites part, and it's a lot more complicated. It wasn't just a racist shooting blacks. You had another white coming to the aid of the blacks who were being shot there and stopping the attack and making sure nobody else was hurt. In fact, the customer did shoot the murderer, and the murderer got in his car, drove away, but only made it about a mile down the road before he passed out. And that's where the police were able to go and arrest him, because he was passed out in his car because of the serious wound that he'd gotten from the permit holder. And, I mean, I don't know, maybe it fit the narrative or whatever that they wanted to go and have at the time, but it was a lot more complicated story than the national media let it, out as being. And maybe part of it was they didn't want to mention a concealed carry permit holder. I have no idea. But
yeah, you're more optimistic than me. I think that's exactly what it was personally. And I'm not even much in the way of a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that I think there's a conscious attempt at minimizing the number of these type of shootings or highlighting them in the mainstream media, because I do think there is a message that they are trying to convey.
Well, yeah, I think you're probably right. Look, I'll give you one example. Another person I used to have contact with was Jake Tapper at CNN. And after the Parkland shooting, Jake had a town hall down there. And I wrote Jake afterwards. I said, Jake, couldn't you find one person to go and ask a question on kind of the conservative side of this, about Army teachers or something in a positive way? And he says, John, you have to understand, this is a very liberal community. So it's not surprising that everybody came from a gun control perspective that's there. Anyway, a couple months later, there was an attack at a high school in Santa Fe, Texas. And there you had a lot of the parents upset that the school hadn't allowed teachers or staff to be able to go and carry.
I was actually there.
I asked Jake, I said, so are you going to have a town hall now down in Texas? And of course, he wasn't interested in doing that. So I think it kind of fits in with what you're saying. And I see this in many ways, I'll give you one other case that did get national attention and that they botched up, and that is, you remember the church outside of Fort Worth in late 2019 where there was an attack, and the national media overwhelmingly just described it as a security guard going and stopping the attack. And in fact, these were just parishioners that were there. But I think the reason why the media mentioned that somebody in the church with a gun had done it was because they thought it was a security guard. If they had gone and tried to, if it had been mentioned up front that it was just a regular parishioner, there was like 18 or 19 parishioners in the church that were carrying permanently concealed handguns at the time of the attack. I don't think it would have gotten the same type of national news coverage.
Well, they actually tried to, I'm going to say, I don't think it was a collective attempt, but what was interesting about that particular shooting and them highlighting it immediately, I remember Bloomberg making a statement regarding it.
Right, exactly.
And he was like, I don't believe anybody. Essentially, what he said was, unless you're a cop, I don't believe you should have a gun. And this is immediately after you had regular people with firearms save a bunch of people with their firearms. And I remember doing a video on that, and I thought to myself when I saw that, I'm like, Jesus, like I can't tell if it's just this kind of lustful desire for power and control, or if it's just a disconnect in terms of the type of life that they live or the bubble that they live in, where they just they can't fathom the idea of regular people being able to protect themselves with firearms. Right.
Well, I have to say, as I said, I've been an academic most of my life, and it's amazing how many people think that they're so much smarter than other people and that they're the ones who should be making decisions for other people. And, because academics are like that all over the place, and of course we know how perfectly they run things when they get in charge. But in any case, just to kind of mine your point a little bit, I often am asked, why is it that liberals go and push for things like gun control? And it kind of bringing up the points that you're just making. And the answer I have to them is that I don't think it's anything unique about their views on guns. I think it's kind of their view on the world. So take something like healthcare. Mm-hmm. Obamacare said, this is what healthcare is going to cover. The only choice you have is really the size of the deductible that you're going to be able to get. Because we don't trust individuals to be able to go and make good decisions on what their health care is supposed to cover. A Republican view often is, if you're going to help people, give them a voucher and let them go out and shop and try to find out what they think best fits them. And they can pick whatever they want to pick there. And the thing is, if you don't trust people to make decisions on even what is be covered by their health insurance, how are you going to trust them on things like carrying a weapon? In some sense, whether or not you trust people for carrying a weapon is like the ultimate in whether or not you trust them or not. The irony that we've seen this last year is that many of Bloomberg's groups, like the Trace and whatever, have been questioning whether even police should be able to go and have guns. So it's not even clear that some people want the police to do it. But I think the big thing that they have about police is that police as a group tend to be very conservative. Mm-hmm. And it's a group that they haven't been able to go and control. And so, they talk about kind of the systemic racism and just replacing the police that's there. They just want to replace them with people who they can kind of control their views from the beginning, to have, social welfare workers or something else in there to do it. My big fear is, who's harmed by these types of social policies with regard to crime? Where do they think these riots occurred? What part of town do you think the crime's occurring? Who's being harmed? What businesses are being destroyed? Who owns many of those businesses? Who shops in those stores? Who works in those places? It's basically poor blacks that are being hurt, or poor Hispanics. And, they claim that they care about these types of individuals, but I look at these policies where they go and order police to stand down, or cutting police budgets. You mentioned defunding the police. You have places where half the inmates or more have been released from jails and prisons across the country over the last year. You have prosecutors in many of these urban areas like Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago and St. Louis and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Portland, Seattle, that are refusing to go and prosecute many violent criminals. Who's being hurt by having the increase in crime? I mean, to me, it's obvious why you have the increase in crime that occurs. If you don't make it risky for criminals to go and commit crime, guess what? You're going to have a lot more crime. So in Chicago, people say, well, why is it that Chicago has such a violence problem? Mm-hmm. You're talking about less than 20% of murderers get arrested in Chicago. And gang murderers get arrested at an even lower rate. And not everybody's being prosecuted. So if you're talking about something that maybe not much more than 10% probability of a gang murder ending up in prison for going in and committing a murder, it's not surprising that you're going to see a lot more of those types of crimes occurring. So you have drive-by shootings where gang members are fighting each out over drug turf, and some little tiny girl gets hurt, getting in the crossfire there. Biden keeps on talking about gun violence. One thing people don't understand also is that 92% of violent crime doesn't involve guns in any way. So when Biden goes and has his 3 big speeches that he's given on violence so far this year, he's mentioned guns or gun violence 148 times in those 3 speeches. He's mentioned police or policing 4 times, and one of those was for police enforcing gun control laws. He hasn't mentioned prisons once. He hasn't mentioned prosecutors once doing their job. there. You know, you just need good nuts and bolts thing to make it risky for criminals to go and commit crime. And until he's willing to do those types of things, I don't think he's serious in terms of trying to make it safe for people who live and have to live in these high crime areas. And just one other thing to mention here, and that is his proposals that he has on gun control are going to disarm the very people that he claims that he cares about. So, you know, at the same time, he's making it so that the law enforcement can't do their job. He wants to make it so that the poor people are the ones who are going to be priced out. So I was just working in the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I wanted to do when I was there to look at the NICS background check system, the background check system for purchasing guns, because we hear now that there's 3.8 million prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks.
Yeah.
But that's false. What they should say is there have been 3.8 million initial denials, and about 99% of those are mistakes. Yep. And when I was at the Department of Justice, I saw information indicating to me that the error rate for black males is more than 3 times their share of the population. The error rate for Hispanic males is 2.5 times their share of the population. And there's no reason why these mistakes should occur. You can appeal when they make the mistake, but most people are going to find it necessary to go and hire a lawyer to go and do that. You're talking about starting costs of $3,000. People may want to have a gun, but is it worth $3,000 for them to go and fix a mistake that the government made? There's no reason these mistakes should be occurring. I've tried for 20 years to get Democrats and gun control activists to agree to try to fix this type of thing, but they will fight you tooth and nail against what I think is a reasonable fix. They talk about, well, we want reasonable gun control laws. Yeah. Well, I want reasonable fixes to the mistakes and errors in the gun control laws, and somebody needs to come up with an explanation for me why it's reasonable to have a system that so horribly discriminates against minorities. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 33% of black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning a gun because of felony records. Whose names are their names being confused with? Other law-abiding, good black males who want to go and get a gun to protect themselves and their families. And there's no reason that that mistake should occur. If private companies had an error rate that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has, those private companies would be sued out of existence. Yeah. Why not make the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? And on top of that, just look at the costs. In Washington, D.C., where they're voting on this stuff, it costs $125 to do a background check on a private transfer of a gun. Just to give you an idea of how nutsy this is, let's say you and I lived in D.C., and I'm going to go and give you 4 guns. It's just one person giving one other person the 4 guns. You think it just should be one background check, right? Because it's the same person getting all the guns. But no, whether it's California or Colorado or D.C. or many of these other places, they require a separate background check on each gun. So rather than $125, it's like $500. You look at that, you say, it seems obvious they're just trying to make it costly and difficult for law-abiding citizens to be able to go and get guns. Who do they think they're stopping? It may not stop you or I from being able to go and get a gun. We can afford the $125. But the very people that my research shows who benefit the most, poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas, making them have to pay these fees might stop them from doing it. And there are 2 points here to make. One is, if you believe that these background checks reduce violent crime, you believe it reduces violent crime for everybody, not just the individual who's going out of their way to do the background check on the gun. And as an economist, I would say if everybody benefits, everybody should pay. Why make that one law-abiding individual have to bear the full freight? And the second thing is, if you think these background checks are good and helpful, and I'm very skeptical of that, but if you believe that, then what you do is you want to encourage people to go and do the background check. How is making them pay essentially $125 tax on doing that, encouraging them to go and obey the law there on that thing. So if you want to set this up, another reasonable change, I think, is to pay for this out of general revenue. But Democrats, again, I've been saying for 20 years, if they make a few reasonable fixes, get rid of the mistakes, pay for the costs out of general revenue, they would eliminate the vast majority of opposition to these background checks on private transfers of guns. But Democrats and gun control advocates will fight in tooth and nail against these reasonable fixes there. Anyway, I'm sorry for going on, but I get very upset when I talk about this stuff, and it just...
you brought up a point I never even thought about before, too. If this generally was about incentivizing people to get background checks and not just a punitive measure to dissuade people from getting guns in general, you'd make it as easy as possible to get these background checks, and by easy meaning even monetarily so. But like you pointed out, that's not even an option on the table.
Right. They will fight you against that. Here's the irony. I mean, Democrats will get upset that free voter IDs are too much of a hurdle for blacks to be able to go and get, or poor Hispanics. But you have to get an ID to do a background check on a gun. You have to pay these fees. In many places, the fees are much more than just having to do the background checks that are there. People don't see the cost of the background checks when they buy a new gun because it's in the price of the gun. It's not like a sales tax that gets added on top of that. It's like they go out of their way. One example I often give to people is compare Illinois and Indiana. You have two states that are right next to each other. Illinois run by Democrats, obviously. Indiana run by Republicans. In Illinois, only about 3% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, over 20% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. Why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. In Illinois, the total cost of getting a concealed handgun permit is about $450. In Indiana, now it's $0. Okay? So, and it's not just the number of people who get permits or the percent. It's also the mix. In Illinois, it's overwhelmingly white males who live in the suburb, wealthy white males who are able to pay the $450 to do it. In Indiana, you see much more diversity by race and also poverty, income level in terms of the people who go and get permits. So, in Illinois, it's kind of like they went through a whole checklist. Up until very recently, there were no training facilities inside Chicago. You have 16 hours of training. If you were poor and didn't have a car, you weren't allowed to take public transportation, even with a concealed handgun permit. You're not allowed to go take a gun on public transportation in Chicago or Illinois. And so you have to go and borrow somebody's car. It's 16 hours of training, so you're talking about either 2 or 4 days of training that's there. It's like they went through a checklist and say, what can we do
to make this as hard as possible?
Sure that poor minorities aren't going to be able to go and get a permanent concealed handgun. A few years ago, I got a list of all the people in Los Angeles County who had a concealed handgun permit.
It should be interesting.
There's only like 216 out of 8 million adults that had a concealed handgun permit. And what you find is it's basically very politically connected, wealthy white males who are the ones who got it. So nationwide, about 30% of concealed carry permit holders are women. In Los Angeles County, it was 7%. Nationwide, about 13% of permit holders are black. In Los Angeles County, it's 5%. In Los Angeles County, is 54% Hispanic. Only 6% of the permit holders in Los Angeles County are Hispanic. Now, is it that women aren't stalked? That they don't have to worry about crime in Los Angeles County? That somehow that's a place where women aren't attacked or stalked? No, I mean, that's ridiculous. Is it just that blacks don't have crimes committed against them in Los Angeles County? Again, it's a ridiculous comment that's there. But the thing is, in Los Angeles County, you've had to provide what's considered, quote, a good reason for them granting you the permit. And apparently the only people that they think have good reasons for being able to go and get a permit are politically connected, wealthy, white guys that are there.
Yep. And, it's funny because we always talk about the idea that gun control is inherently racist. But let's say we remove all of that, because they're the same political party that talks about the disparate impact of particular laws with respect to different races. And we pointed out time after time after time after time after time that the inherent impact of gun control laws are inherently negative towards minorities. We've always demonstrated that over and over and over again. But yet when we try to have those conversations with them on it, they never want to have those conversations, ever. And so I get a lot of heat on at least on my platform with respect to the way I kind of address different Democrat politicians on the issue of firearms and gun restrictions. And they'll call me a hypocrite because I never talk about the Republican politicians. And I'm sure they're out there. They just don't do it to the degree of Democrat politicians. And yet and still, like we talked about earlier about CNN and how they kind of handled the forum after the Newtown shooting. No, not Newtown, sorry. The Parkland. And I go on Fox. I've been on Fox consistently for a while now. And I get a lot of people who ask me, they're like, why are you, especially a lot of my more liberal friends, why are you always going on Fox? Why are you always going on Fox and you won't go on other programs? And you
probably would if they asked you.
I would go anywhere if they asked me. But they never had me.
I have the same problem. Look, I can't tell you the number of times over the years where I've been invited to be on CNN or MSNBC, and I'm driving into the station, and I get a call from the producer saying, well, the guy from Everytown, the research director, is refusing to be on air with you, and so we have to disinvite you from doing it. And I can't even imagine going and saying, I want to choose who I get to go and debate on TV. I mean, I would pay to be able to go and have these guys on. I had a couple times where it's kind of backfired on them. I'll give you one short story. I don't know, about 5 years ago, I was invited to be on C-SPAN's Washington Journal. And I was supposed to be on for an hour. The producer called me up, said that I would be debating the research director from Bloomberg's Everytown. I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. So anyway, she called him back and said, okay, we got John Lott to be the other side of the presentation. And he tried to convince her not to have me on. And she said, well, we've already invited him. And he said, oh, gosh, I'm sorry. I just realized I have a conflict with my schedule. I'm not able to go and do that. I'm sorry. He was expecting her, I guess, just to cancel the segment then. Yeah. Which said, well, that's really too bad. We were really hoping you'd do it. I guess we'll still do it. We'll just have Lott on for the hour. And he said, oh, it turns out I can do it, but I can only do it for the last half hour, and I can't do it at the same time Lott's on. And she was so ticked off at how he was dealing with her about that. She calls me up, and she tells me what happens. And then she says, because apparently he wanted to go on after me so he could hear what I said before he talked.
Gotcha.
And she said she really wanted me during my segment to bring up the fact that I had been hoping that both of us would be on the same time, but that he wouldn't appear with me. And so I said that actually on air. I said the producer asked me to say this. And then the first call that they let in for the guy was somebody asking why he wouldn't debate me. So I'm sure the producer got that in there. That's probably about the only time that's really been somewhat embarrassing for them to go and pull that stunt. But I mean, they get their way virtually all the time.
Yeah, they really
all I can say is if you ever can't do Fox, let me know. I'll be thrilled to do it.
Okay. And I'll end it with this story. And I don't think I've actually told this story in public before. I think I've mentioned it a little bit, but this was a long time ago. This is kind of at the more of the genesis of my 2A advocacy. Someone reached out to me to go and have a fire. So this is back when Google was kind of doing their fireside chats with the presidents. And this is when Obama was in office. And I was supposed to, and they wanted me to come on and be one of the individuals to ask Obama a question.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And yeah, no, I was looking forward to it, right? You know, I mean, I was pretty new into this, but, you know, I was kind of starting to hit my peak. And, you know, so I was looking forward to it. I took it really seriously. I sat down. I thought of like genuine questions. They weren't just kind of a gotcha, you know. And I submitted those questions and they looked at them and they were like, yeah, that's great. These are great questions. And I was like, thank you. And so they were like, we're really excited to have you on. And so I want to say, I think it was a day before I was supposed to go on, you know, they submitted questions. They told me I'm going to be on, going to be good to go. I got my whole system set up so I could do the fireside chat. And then that evening, and I was really excited. And don't get me wrong, I'd been a big critiquer of Obama's policies with respect to firearms, but nonetheless, you get an ability to sit and have a conversation or talk to the president. It is what it is, right? So I get an email back, and it tells me, and I still have this email to this day, and they tell me, look, the White House wants us to replace you. They basically said you were good to go until they found out who you were. And once that happened, they switched me out for someone else. And then that person asked some innocuous question about guns and then just moved on. And so that was like my first experience with that kind of almost gatekeeping as far as the conversation is concerned. And so I'm right there with you. I can empathize with the idea that they won't have you on. I've been on CNN before, but I wasn't on CNN. The only time I was on CNN was when they brought up a video that I did after a particular shooting, and then they had the family on there to respond to my video. And then they took what I was saying out of context and then didn't allow me to come on and state my piece.
Well, it's been a few years since I've been on CNN, but I think, unfortunately, the media bias has just gotten out of control. I mean, now, you know, at least at one time, there was kind of this journalistic kind of ethos that you would go and have both sides on the debate. I don't think CNN or MSNBC for years, or ABC, NBC, CBS, I think or the New York Times or other places, it's just amazing. They don't really care about having both sides of the debate.
Those days are
there. Cool. And it really is a disservice, I think, to people. But, I mean, there's still a few outlets out there that do it, but for the vast majority of people who listen to the mainstream news, they're not getting the other side of the argument.
They're not at all. Not at all.
I appreciate you being there. I don't know where we'd be if it wasn't for people like you. So.
Oh, much appreciated. Much appreciated. That being said, I've bought your books. I have them. I've read.
I guess I'll owe you a dinner then.
I actually hadn't started Gun Control Myths. I have done. I read The War on Guns, and I do recommend it for anybody watching this particular podcast. It does a great. It does
Gun Control Myths.
Say it again.
Gun Control Myths. It came out last fall.
Last fall. Okay.
Yeah.
And so
there's like 45 different myths about gun control issues.
Perfect. Is there anywhere else that people can go to as far as resources, as far as following the work that you do with the organization with the Crime Prevention Research Center?
Yeah, well, our website is crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. And I'd like to think we have a lot of information there. We really put a lot of time to put different studies. There's a tab there that you can go and see our research reports that we put out. And I like to think we're like the only ones that do a lot of the research that's there on these different issues. So, but it doesn't do us any good if people don't see it. So, you know, we have like 15,000 people who sign up for our email blasts that we send out once every 2 weeks. And, you know, I hope people sign up for it.
Yeah, a bare minimum, if you're watching this, I think it makes the easiest way to ascertain this information is to at least sign up for the email blast, because at there you can go on about your life, and then when you happen to scroll through your email, you can see headlines that pique your curiosity that you may want to learn information about, and then you can go ahead and peruse or continue to read the information that's presented in front of you. Because I'm always trying to figure out the best and easiest way to get the information into the hands of people, especially people who are watching these conversations. So that's one easy way to do it. Sign up for the email blast. It's passive. Just sign up for it. If you see a title that you like, read it.
I send it out once every 2 weeks, and we're not dunning people for donations. It's just trying to get the information out for people.
Awesome.
So
awesome.
But thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining me and having this conversation. I look forward to having you back. I'm pretty sure I will end up having you back pretty regularly, considering all the things that tend to come up that you have a vast wealth of knowledge on. So feel free to reach out to me anytime, and I look forward to having more conversations down the road.
Well, likewise. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. You know how frightening it is to think about what happens in the moments before, during, and even days after having to use your gun in self-defense? When you first start carrying a gun for protection, it can be a very scary and nerve-wracking experience, especially if you haven't gotten the education and training you need to feel confident. I've been there myself, hoping I never have to go through a self-defense shooting, which is why I'm a member of the USCCA. As a USCCA member, you can eliminate some of the stress of carrying a gun for protection by accessing the amazing wealth of firearm education, training, and current state-specific gun laws of your state or states you may travel to. This can help you be prepared for, or hopefully even avoid, a self-defense incident. As a bonus, members automatically become insured on the self-defense liability insurance policy purchased by and issued to the USCCA. Click below to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, make sure you hit that bell symbol.